I never thought it would happen like this. The weekend had been planned for months. Tim and I had been looking forward to it for so long. A wedding in another state, far away from home, seemed like the perfect opportunity for us to spend quality time together. After 5 years of marriage, everything had become routine. Tim's job kept him so busy that it felt like we were just two people passing each other by, caught up in the business of life. Our conversations had become short, mostly about work or bills or what we had to do next. The spark we once had seemed to dim. But this trip was different. It was supposed to be a chance for us to reconnect, to break free from the monotony and share something special. Just the two of us, away from the distractions of everyday life. Tim was excited about the idea and suggested we drive to the wedding. It seemed like a great way to spend time together, he said. He called it a bonding exercise, hours on the road, with no one but each other to talk to. The thought of a long drive, just the two of us, felt like the perfect escape from the routine that had been swallowing us whole. At first, everything felt perfect. I imagined us laughing, talking, rediscovering each other like we had when we first met. We could listen to music, stop for snacks along the way, and enjoy the time together. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like just what we needed. But there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. Tim's friend, Carson. Tim and Carson had been best friends since college. It was hard to remember a time when they weren't inseparable. They were more than just friends. They were brothers. Tim often talked about how Carson had always been there for him through thick and thin. Whenever Tim was going through something tough, Carson was the one he turned to, and vice versa. It was clear that their bond was deep, almost unbreakable. But no matter how close their friendship was, I always felt a little uncomfortable around Carson. When Tim suggested we stay at Carson's house instead of a hotel, I tried to hide my discomfort. It would be more comfortable, Tim had said. Carson had insisted, too, telling us that it would be easier for everyone, and that since we were a family, there was no need to spend money on a hotel. It sounded reasonable at first, but there was something about Carson's charm and his easy smile that made me uneasy. Deep down, I knew that this weekend was going to be more complicated than I had imagined. I had met Carson a few times before, but each encounter left a lasting impression on me. Every time we saw each other, whether it was at a party, a casual dinner, or a gathering of friends, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him in a way that I couldn't explain. Carson had this natural charisma, a magnetic pull that made him stand out in any crowd. He didn't even need to try. It was as if the air around him became more charged when he entered the room. He was in his 40s, but he looked much younger. His body was still in incredible shape, and it was obvious he took care of himself. His muscles were toned, not too bulky but strong and defined, as if he spent hours at the gym, which I imagined he did. Whenever Carson's gaze would land on me, I felt something stir deep inside me. I was married, after all. I had my life with Tim, the man I loved deeply, the man I had vowed to spend my life with. I was committed to him. So why did I feel this way about Carson? It wasn't right. I tried to brush the feelings off, to push them aside like they didn't exist, but they always crept back into my thoughts. I imagined what it would be like to be with Carson, to feel his touch, his warmth, to be the one he was focused on. The more I tried to push it away, the stronger it became, a longing that wouldn't go away. And now, here I was, about to spend time under his roof for the first time in years. We were staying at his place for the weekend, Tim's best friend. I tried to tell myself it would be fine, that I would be able to control the feelings that swirled inside me. But I wasn't so sure anymore. How could I ignore the way my body reacted when he was near? How could I pretend I didn't feel the way I did about him? I was scared of what might happen, scared of the way I might slip into the old thoughts, the ones I knew I shouldn't have. But at the same time, there was a part of me that wanted to let go, to let the yearning I had for Carson come to the surface and see where it would take me. As we drove through the rain, the conversation with Tim was light, just the two of us in the car, but my mind kept drifting. What would it be like to spend an entire evening with Carson, alone, in his space, surrounded by his undeniable charisma? When we finally arrived at Carson's house, the rain had turned into a downpour. The house was upscale, modern yet welcoming, a stark contrast to the small apartment Tim and I shared. It was spacious, with 4 bedrooms and a living room that spoke of taste and elegance. Carson greeted us warmly at the door, his charm effortlessly filling the room as if he hadn't just invited us into his home but had planned this from the start. "Welcome, welcome," he said, smiling. "It's been too long." I smiled back, trying to suppress the nervous flutter in my chest. I had to remind myself this was Tim's best friend. He was a guest, not someone I should be thinking about in ways I shouldn't. After settling into the guest room, we joined Carson in the kitchen. He was already preparing a meal, his movements smooth and confident as he worked. Tim jumped in with stories from their college days, and I watched Carson, fascinated. He was easy to talk to, his voice calming, and I found myself listening to every word he said, my attention lingering on the curve of his jaw, the way his biceps flexed when he reached for the wine. Dinner was relaxed. The wine flowed, the laughter grew louder, and as the evening wore on, it felt as though the tension I had been holding on to all day was slowly dissolving. There was something comforting about the way the 3 of us connected. But as the night stretched on, I felt the wine begin to take effect, blurring the edges of my thoughts. When the conversation moved to the porch, I excused myself, claiming it was getting late. I felt the warmth of the wine in my veins, but my thoughts were clouded, and I couldn't shake the fantasy of Carson's touch, the way he had looked at me earlier. My husband, a few beers in, was laughing with Carson, and I knew he wouldn't notice if I slipped away. Back in the guest room, I lay on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The laughter from the living room carried through the walls, the sound growing louder as Tim and Carson's drinks piled up. Sleep was a distant thought, and all I could think of was Carson. It felt like hours before my husband stumbled into the room, drunk and grinning. I barely had time to acknowledge him before I fell asleep, my mind still whirling from the events of the evening. I woke up a few hours later, disoriented and bored. The house was silent, and I assumed Carson was passed out, just like Tim. But as I wandered the halls of the house, admiring the paintings on the walls leading to the living room, I needed something to distract me from the chaos in my mind. Maybe because my body ached for something I couldn't quite name. That's when I heard his voice. I was startled, my heart pounding as I turned slowly, and there he was, Carson, standing just a few inches behind me. His presence was overwhelming, like a force I couldn't escape. He had moved so quietly, so carefully, that I hadn't even heard him approach. Now, I found myself standing face to face with him, unable to move, unable to look away. I felt the heat rising in my chest, a strange mix of fear and desire that swirled together, and I had no idea how to react. My body felt tense, my mind racing, but all I could do was stare at him, too lost in the moment to say anything. "I see you're still awake," he said, his voice low and smooth, almost like he was teasing me. The words hung in the air, as if daring me to respond. "Couldn't sleep either." His words were light, but I felt the weight behind them, the electricity in the air between us. He casually began to explain the story behind the artwork on the wall, but honestly, I barely heard him. My mind wasn't on the art at all. I couldn't stop looking at him, his strong jaw, the way his shirt clung to his muscles, the heat radiating from him. I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to be wrapped up in his arms, to feel his body pressed against mine. My heart raced just thinking about it. Then, suddenly, he stopped speaking. I wasn't sure if he had finished or if he had sensed the shift in the air, but he seemed to notice something change in me. He stepped closer, just enough to close the gap between us. His voice dropped lower, and he said, "You've been looking at me, haven't you?" His words were like a whisper that sent a shiver running down my spine. They felt both like a challenge and a confirmation of what I had been trying so hard to ignore. I wanted to deny it, to say something, but no words came. Before I could gather my thoughts, before I could even move, he leaned in, and then he kissed me. I should have stopped it. I should have pulled away. I should have remembered who I was with, who I was betraying. But I didn't. It felt so good, so right in that moment. His lips were soft and tender, and they pressed against mine with a gentleness that took my breath away. I couldn't bring myself to pull away. His kiss was everything I hadn't realized I'd been craving. It was warm, urgent, yet soothing all at once. The kiss deepened, and I felt myself surrender to it. It was as if I had been holding my breath for years, waiting for something, someone, to break through the walls I had carefully built around myself. And now, with Carson's lips on mine, I could finally exhale. I couldn't believe it was happening, but at the same time, I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want to pull away. It was quick, almost too quick. Before I knew it, his hands were on me, pulling me closer. Our bodies pressed together, the heat between us growing, our hands roaming each other's skin. I didn't hesitate. My hands found their way to his chest, tracing the hard lines of his muscles, and in no time at all, we were tangled in each other. It felt like an explosion of electricity, every nerve in my body alive with anticipation, with hunger, with a longing that had been buried for too long. It was intense and passionate, and it was like nothing I had ever felt before. Every inch of my skin seemed to tingle with desire, and I didn't want it to stop. It felt like a moment I couldn't control, a moment I didn't want to control. Afterward, as we cleaned up, I found myself numb, lost in the weight of what had just happened. I told him goodnight, my voice shaking. I needed to leave before Tim realized I was gone. The entire night felt like a blur. When I finally returned to the room, it felt like a lifetime had passed. I slid into bed beside my husband, trying to settle my racing mind. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts kept drifting back to Carson. His presence lingered in my mind, his touch, his voice, the way he had kissed me. Tim's soft snores filled the space, grounding me in the present, but it only reminded me that he was there, completely unaware. The next morning, everything felt normal. I couldn't look at Carson the same way. Every time I saw him, the memory of last night would flash in my mind, and I felt a twinge of guilt mixed with something else. I couldn't look at Tim the same way either. The man I had married, the man I had promised to love and cherish. But I knew that this one night with Carson had changed everything. The way I saw myself, the way I saw Tim, and the way I saw my future, it was all different now. The question that kept running through my mind was, could I live with this secret, with the guilt that now settled like a stone in my chest? Or would it slowly consume me, tearing apart the life I had built? Only time will tell.